Have you ever wondered if you could lose your soul without ever knowing it happened? Though not in one dramatic fall, but so gradually, so quietly, that you wake up one day and realize you stopped believing God would rescue you? Across 500 years of Catholic teaching, one question has haunted confessors more than any other. When does lukewarmness become permanent? When does the soul finally give up without ever saying the words out loud? Within this mystery, Saint Teresa of Avila saw something that terrified her more than her famous vision of hell. She watched souls drift, slowly, peacefully, away from the castle. Teresa Sanchez de Cepeda y Ahumada was born on March 28, 1515, in a stone-walled city called Avila. Her father was a converso, a Jewish man who converted to Christianity. The Inquisition had shamed him publicly once, dragged him through the streets in a procession for supposedly returning to Jewish practices. The family survived, but they carried that secret like a stone around their necks. Purity of blood mattered in Spain. One wrong word, one accusation, and you disappeared. Teresa grew up reading stories about martyrs. At 7 years old, she tried to run away to Africa with her brother Rodrigo. They wanted to die fighting the Moors, to buy heaven cheap with their blood. They made it as far as the outer walls before an uncle caught them and dragged them home. Her father locked the doors after that, but Teresa's hunger for something bigger never left. It just changed shape. At 15, her father noticed she'd grown worldly. She loved romance novels, the kind filled with knights and forbidden love. She spent hours reading them with her cousins, giggling about things good girls weren't supposed to think about. Her devotion cooled. Mass became a routine. Prayer felt empty. So her father sent her to an Augustinian convent school in Avila, hoping the nuns would fix whatever had broken inside her. 8 days in that convent felt like prison. But then something shifted. One of the nuns kept repeating a phrase to her. Many are called, but few are chosen. Many are called, few are chosen. Teresa started thinking about eternity again. She started praying again. But she didn't have the courage yet to become a nun herself. She just knew she couldn't go back to the way she had been living. She entered the Carmelite convent of the Incarnation in November 1535, 20 years old. Against her father's wishes, she sneaked out of the house before dawn and never looked back. When she took the habit, God flooded her with consolation. Everything felt right. Every prayer felt alive. Every moment in chapel felt like coming home. Then her body started failing. Fainting spells, heart pain, a sickness no doctor could diagnose. She spent months paralyzed, so close to death that they dug her grave and prepared her funeral. She woke up 4 hours before they planned to bury her. Her eyes opened in the coffin. The nuns screamed. She recovered slowly. 3 years. But when she came back to the convent, something inside her had changed. The fire was gone. She started making excuses. She told herself she was too sick to pray deeply. She said mental prayer was too hard for someone as weak as she was. She attended the offices. She said the words. But her heart wasn't in it. She became lukewarm, comfortable, safe. This lasted 18 years. 18 years of living as a nun without really living. She was surrounded by other nuns who were the same. The convent of the Incarnation allowed visitors. Lots of visitors. Young men came to the parlor to flirt with the nuns. The sisters wore jewelry. They arranged their veils to look attractive. They talked about fashion and gossip and money. It wasn't sinful exactly. It was just empty. Teresa later called it the most dangerous time of her life because she didn't know she was in danger. In 1554, at 39 years old, she was walking through the oratory after confession. She saw a statue, Christ bound at the pillar, whipped, bleeding. Something broke open inside her chest. She fell to the floor, weeping. She couldn't stop. All she could think was how much he had suffered for her, and how little she had given back. That same year, she read St. Augustine's Confessions, the part where he describes his own conversion, his years of wandering, his desperate prayer, "Give me chastity, but not yet." Teresa saw herself in those words. She had been saying the same thing for 18 years. "Not yet, Lord. Let me enjoy this comfortable life just a little longer." She made a decision. No more excuses, no more half measures. She would pray, really pray, even if it killed her. She would give God everything or nothing. The visions started soon after. Locutions, words she heard inside her mind that were not her own thoughts. Images of Christ appearing in her cell. She saw his hands first, then his face, then his whole body, glorified, radiant, more beautiful than anything she had ever imagined. She begged God to stop. People were already whispering that she was possessed. Her confessors didn't know what to think. One priest told her to make an obscene gesture called the fig every time Christ appeared, to test whether it was really the devil. She obeyed. She felt humiliated. Christ never seemed angry. He just waited. Then came the vision that changed everything. It happened one day while she was praying. Suddenly, without warning, she found herself standing at the entrance to hell. She writes in her autobiography that it lasted only a moment. But even if she lived 1,000 years, she said, she would never forget it. The entrance looked like a narrow passage. A furnace, low ceiling, dark, no air. The floor was covered in filthy mud that smelled like rot. Reptiles crawled everywhere. At the end of the passage, there was a hole in the wall, like a cupboard carved into stone. She found herself stuffed inside it. No room to sit, no room to lie down. The walls closed in. She couldn't breathe, but the physical pain was nothing compared to what she felt inside. An interior fire, a despair so total that words couldn't describe it. She said it felt like her soul was tearing itself apart, not being torn by someone else, tearing itself, ripping its own flesh with its own hands. And the worst part? She knew there was no hope, no consolation, no end, ever. She understood in that moment that this was the place the devils had prepared for her sins, for those 18 years of lukewarmness, for all the times she had known what to do and chosen not to do it, for all the grace she had wasted. She deserved this, and if she died in that state, this is where she would end up, forever. When the vision ended, she was shaking. She couldn't speak for hours. Her sisters found her on the floor, her body cold, her face white as a corpse. She couldn't explain what had happened, but from that day forward, she lived differently. Every suffering in this life felt light compared to that interior fire. Every insult, every disappointment, every physical pain, it all seemed like nothing, because she had seen the alternative. But Teresa didn't just see hell. She also saw something else, something she wrote about in her book, The Interior Castle, which she finished on November 29th, 1577, in the monastery of St. Joseph in Avila. She described the soul as a castle made of a single diamond, 7 layers of rooms, 7 mansions. In the very center, the king dwells, God himself. The whole castle glows because of his light. The closer you get to the center, the brighter everything becomes. But here's the thing Teresa saw that most people miss. She didn't just describe the people in the 7th mansion, the ones who reached the spiritual marriage with God. She spent most of her time talking about the people in the 1st mansion, the ones who barely made it inside, the ones who entered the castle but brought all the reptiles with them. If you value documented Catholic teaching and mystical theology like this, subscribe. It's the best way to support our work. Also comment from which city you're hearing this from. This script is researched and factual, using sources from the definitive Kavanaugh and Rodriguez translation of Teresa's collected works, published by ICS Publications in Washington, along with her original Life of Teresa of Jesus, and documented testimonies from the Carmelite spiritual tradition preserved in the archives of the Discalced Carmelite order. Now back to the information. The 1st mansion is where most Catholics live. Teresa describes them clearly. They pray, but not often, maybe a few times a month, maybe a Hail Mary before bed. They go to Mass, but their minds wander. They confess their sins, but they don't really change. They're in a state of grace, technically, but they're distracted, worldly, comfortable. The reptiles from outside the castle, the venomous creatures that represent sin and temptation, they've followed these souls inside. And these souls don't even notice. Teresa says these people walk in semi-darkness. They can't see the beauty of the king in the center. They want to, sometimes, but they're too surrounded by noise, too busy, too attached to the esteem of others, too worried about money, health, reputation. The devil, Teresa writes, easily conquers them, not through big temptations, through small ones, through distractions, through comfort. And here's what terrified Teresa most. These souls don't think anything is wrong. They're baptized. They go to church. They're not committing mortal sins. They think they're fine, but they're not fine. They're in danger, mortal danger, because they're doing the bare minimum to stay in a state of grace. And the bare minimum is a razor's edge. One bad decision, one moment of pride, one unconfessed sin, and they fall. Teresa watched this happen. In her convent, before the Reform, she saw nuns who had entered with fire in their hearts slowly lose it. They started innocent, then they made friends with visitors. Then they started caring too much about nice clothes. Then they stopped praying deeply. Then they started gossiping. Then they started resenting the stricter nuns. Then they stopped caring whether God was pleased or not. It happened so slowly, so naturally. No one woke up one day and decided to reject God. They just drifted. In the 2nd mansion, Teresa says, the soul hears God calling, loud and clear, through sermons, through good books, through other people's advice, through sickness, through brief moments in prayer. God is shouting. But the soul is in a tug of war, one side pulling toward God, the other side pulling toward comfort, pleasure, the world. These souls have gained understanding. They know they're in danger, but they haven't made the decision to change. They keep one foot in the world and one foot in prayer. And Teresa says this is more painful than the 1st mansion, because now they can hear, but they can't speak. They're like people who can understand a language but can't form the words to respond. The devils attack them viciously in this stage, not with obvious evil, with reasonable arguments. They whisper, those penances will ruin your health. You're being extreme. You can serve God and still enjoy the world a little. You're not called to be a saint. You're just ordinary. Be realistic. And many souls believe it. They settle. They stay in the second mansion for years, maybe their whole lives. They never fall into mortal sin, but they never move forward either. They're stuck, lukewarm. And Teresa writes that this is a kind of death, a slow death, because the soul knows it's made for more. It hears the king calling from the center of the castle, but it's too afraid to leave the courtyard. Teresa also describes another vision, one that many people don't know about. She saw a soul, a beautiful soul, a diamond castle glowing with light, with God residing in the center. Then, as she watched, the soul fell into mortal sin. The light vanished. The crystal became opaque, dark as coal. It emitted an intolerable stench. The venomous creatures that had been held outside now swarmed through every room. The king was still there in the center, but no one could see him anymore. The entire castle was plunged into darkness. She told her confessor about this vision the same day. She said she could barely believe what she had seen, that a soul made in the image of God, capable of holding the divine presence, could become so hideous. She said if everyone could see this, if everyone could understand what mortal sin does to the soul, no one would ever sin again. No one would dare. Because the difference between grace and sin is not like going from light to dim. It's like going from a palace of diamonds to a pit of rotting corpses. But here's the question. Teresa never answered directly. What about the souls who never commit mortal sin but never move forward? What about the ones who stay in the first or second mansion their entire lives? Are they saved? Are they lost? Are they safe? She doesn't say, she just warns. Over and over, she says, the first mansion is dangerous, the second mansion is more dangerous, not because of what you're doing, because of what you're not doing, because you're supposed to be moving. The castle has 7 layers. God is waiting in the center. If you stay at the edges, if you stop trying, if you convince yourself that being technically in a state of grace is enough, you are in the most dangerous position possible. Because you think you're safe, and that's when the devil doesn't need to attack you anymore. He just waits. Teresa tells a story that haunted her for years. She doesn't give the man's name. She just calls him a priest she knew, a priest who said Mass for many years. One day, while Teresa was in prayer, she saw his soul fall into hell. She saw it happen, in an instant, like a stone dropped from a great height. The demon seized him with fury. She writes that the sight struck her with terror. She couldn't understand it. He had been a priest. He had consecrated the Eucharist hundreds of times. He had heard confessions. He had preached. How could this happen? Then she understood. God allowed her to see it so she would know. The exterior means nothing if the interior is dead. You can perform all the right actions, say all the right words, and still be lost. Because what matters is the state of your will. Are you moving toward God? Or are you standing still, content with the courtyard, while the king waits in the center? Teresa spent the rest of her life trying to wake people up. She founded 17 reformed convents, monasteries where the rule was strict, poverty, silence, fasting, hours of mental prayer every day. No visitors, no jewelry, no distractions. Some people accused her of being too extreme. They said she was harming the nuns' health. They said she was proud. They said she was deluded. The Inquisition investigated her writings. They almost condemned her, but she never stopped, because she had seen hell. She had seen lukewarm souls drift away without realizing it, and she would rather die than watch another soul fall asleep in the courtyard. In her book, The Way of Perfection, written before 1567 at the direction of her confessor, she talks about souls who give up prayer because they find it too difficult. She says this is the greatest tragedy, because prayer is the door. It's the only door into the castle. If you stop praying, you're locked outside. It doesn't matter if you still go to Mass. It doesn't matter if you still call yourself a Catholic. If you're not entering into your own soul, if you're not seeking God in silence, then you're standing outside the walls. And outside the walls, the reptiles will devour you. She also writes about false humility. This is one of the most dangerous traps. People say, I'm too sinful to approach God. I'm too unworthy. I should wait until I'm better. Teresa says this is a lie straight from hell. It sounds humble, but it's pride in disguise. Because you're saying you need to fix yourself before God can love you. You're saying your sins are stronger than His mercy. You're saying you know better than God when you're ready to approach Him. Real humility, Teresa says, is recognizing that you are a sinner and running to God anyway. Real humility is admitting you're weak and asking for help. Real humility is accepting that you will never be worthy on your own, but God makes you worthy. The moment you start waiting to feel good enough is the moment you've stopped trusting God. And that's when hope dies. She saw this in herself. For 18 years, she used her weakness as an excuse. She told herself she was too sick to pray deeply. She told herself she wasn't like the great saints. She told herself God would understand if she just coasted for a while. But God didn't understand, or rather, He understood perfectly. He knew she was lying to herself. He knew she was capable of more. He was just waiting for her to admit it. The turning point came when she stopped making excuses, when she looked at the crucifix and realized that Christ didn't make excuses on the cross. He didn't say, "I'm too tired. I've suffered enough. I deserve a break." He stayed, he endured, he gave everything. And Teresa realized she had been giving nothing. After her conversion at 39, Teresa experienced what she calls the fourth mansion. This is where God starts working supernaturally in the soul, the prayer of quiet, where you feel a mysterious joy that doesn't come from anything you did. It just flows into you, like water poured from above. You can't produce it. You can't control it. You can only receive it. But even in this mansion, Teresa warns, souls can turn back. They can get scared. They can start analyzing the experience instead of surrendering to it. If they refuse the grace, they go backward, not forward, backward. Teresa says the key is perseverance. You don't need to feel anything. You don't need visions. You just need to keep praying, keep entering the castle, keep seeking God in silence, even if it feels dry, even if it feels useless, because God measures faithfulness, not feelings. She tells her nuns, don't worry if you're distracted during prayer. That's normal. That's the reptiles trying to keep you at the edges. Just keep going back, keep returning to the center. Eventually, if you persevere, he will draw you deeper. But if you give up, if you decide it's not worth the effort, then you've made a choice, a deadly choice, because you've decided that comfort is more important than God. You've decided that your judgment is better than his call, and that decision, repeated over months and years, becomes permanent, not because God abandons you, because you've abandoned him. In the sixth mansion, Teresa describes souls who are betrothed to God. They experience visions, raptures. God visits them constantly. They feel an immense longing for him. They suffer spiritual trials that feel like death. Their confessors doubt them. Their friends abandon them. They endure physical illnesses that no doctor can explain, but they don't turn back. They keep moving toward the center. And finally, in the seventh mansion, they reach the spiritual marriage. God removes the scales from their eyes. They see the Trinity. They understand that they will never leave God's presence again. They are united to him permanently, not through their own effort, through his grace. They become his entirely. But Teresa's point is this: the journey from the first mansion to the seventh requires one thing above all: the willingness to move, the willingness to leave the courtyard, the willingness to face the reptiles and keep walking anyway. Most souls never do this. They stay at the edges. They convince themselves that being inside the castle walls is enough. They don't realize that the walls aren't what save you. The king saves you, and he's in the center, not at the entrance. Teresa died on October 4th, 1582, in Alba de Tormes at the age of 67. She had spent 28 years reforming the Carmelite order. She had walked across Spain founding convents, negotiating with bishops, writing books, training nuns, fighting the Inquisition, enduring opposition from within her own order. She had been sick most of her life. She had suffered from headaches, heart pain, paralysis, fainting spells. She had been mocked, slandered, investigated. People had called her a heretic, a fraud, a hysteric. But she never stopped, because she had seen the alternative. She had seen hell. She had seen lukewarm souls drift away. She had seen people who started well and ended badly. She had seen the reptiles win. And she would rather suffer every day of her life than let one more soul believe the lie that lukewarmness is safe. Her body was exhumed 9 months after her death. It hadn't decayed. It smelled like flowers. Her arm was removed and sent to Avila. Her heart was removed and is still preserved in Alba de Tormes. When they examined it, they found a mark, a deep wound, like something had pierced it. Teresa had written about this years earlier. She said an angel appeared to her holding a golden spear tipped with fire. He thrust it into her heart multiple times. The pain was so intense she moaned, but it was also so sweet that she never wanted it to end. She called it a delicious martyrdom, a caress of love so powerful that it left her on fire for God. They found the mark, physical evidence. The wound was real. In 1622, Pope Gregory XV canonized her. In 1970, Pope Paul VI declared her a doctor of the Church, the first woman ever to receive that title. Her writings became required reading for anyone serious about prayer. Her interior castle became one of the most important books in Christian mysticism. Her life influenced countless saints who came after her: Saint Teresa of Lisieux, Saint Edith Stein, Saint John of the Cross. All of them read Teresa. All of them learned from her. All of them credited her with showing them the way. But the lesson Teresa wanted people to learn wasn't complicated. It wasn't mystical. It wasn't about visions or raptures or spiritual marriage. It was this: don't stop, don't settle. Don't convince yourself that lukewarmness is safety. Move. Every day, move a little closer to the center. Pray, even when it's hard. Confess, even when it's humiliating. Read scripture, even when it's boring. Go to Mass, even when you don't feel like it. Fast, even when you're hungry. Give, even when you're poor. Love, even when it hurts. Because the alternative is drift, and drift is how souls die without ever noticing. Teresa's vision of hell wasn't given to scare her into obedience. It was given to wake her up, to show her what was at stake, to prove that eternity is real, judgment is real, and choices matter. Not just big choices, small choices. The choice to pray or not pray, the choice to confess or hide, the choice to move forward or stand still. Most people don't lose their souls in a single moment of rebellion. They lose them slowly, one excuse at a time, one compromise at a time, one distraction at a time, until one day they wake up and realize they've been standing outside the castle for years, and the door is still open, but they've forgotten how to walk. Teresa saw this pattern everywhere, in her convent before the Reform, in priests, in lay people, in everyone who thought they were fine because they were technically Catholic. She saw souls who attended Mass every Sunday, who raised their children in the faith, but who had never once entered the castle, who had never once prayed from the heart, who had never once asked God to show them His will, and she knew where they were headed, not necessarily to hell, but to purgatory, a long, painful purgatory, because they wasted their lives. They had grace available, they had sacraments, they had the church, they had everything they needed to become saints, and they chose mediocrity instead. Teresa's message is urgent. It was urgent in 1577 when she wrote The Interior Castle. It's urgent now, because nothing has changed. People still drift, people still make excuses, people still convince themselves that lukewarmness is enough. People still ignore the king calling from the center. But the king is still calling. The door is still open. The castle is still there. You just have to enter. You just have to move. One step, then another, toward the light, toward the center, toward the only thing that matters. Teresa writes in the Seventh Mansion that when you finally reach the king, when you finally stand in his presence, you realize that everything you endured was worth it. Every suffering, every dark night, all of it was grace, because he was with you the entire time. He never left. But you had to choose to move. You had to choose to trust. You had to choose to hope. And hope is what separates the souls who reach the center from the souls who stay at the edges. Hope says, God wants me. Hope says, He will help me. Hope says, even though I'm weak and sinful, He is stronger. The souls who lose hope are the ones Teresa feared most, because they're the ones who stop trying. They don't commit mortal sin. They don't leave the church. They just stop moving. And staying where you are in the spiritual life is going backward. Teresa's entire life can be summarized in one sentence. She refused to stop. She refused to settle. She refused to let comfort replace God. And because of that refusal, she became one of the greatest saints in church history. Not because she was perfect, but because she kept walking toward the center, toward the king. And that's the choice every person faces. Will you move forward, or will you stay where you are? Will you enter the castle, or will you remain outside, surrounded by reptiles, convinced that you're fine? Will you seek the king, or will you settle for the courtyard? Teresa saw souls who chose the courtyard. She saw them live their whole lives there, comfortable, safe, mediocre. And when they died, she saw what happened. God showed her, and it changed her forever. On her deathbed, Teresa said, I am a daughter of the church. She had fought the Inquisition. She had argued with bishops, but she never left. She never broke communion. She submitted. She obeyed. She trusted that God would work through the institution He had founded, even when the people in charge were wrong. And in the end, the church vindicated her. They canonized her in 1622. They declared her a doctor of the church in 1970. They said, this woman, this sick Spanish nun who could barely walk, who spent most of her life in pain, she understood God better than almost anyone who ever lived. But Teresa would have hated that summary, because it's not about understanding. It's about doing. It's about moving. It's about entering the castle and walking toward the center, one step at a time, even when you can't see the path. Because the king is waiting, and he will not wait forever. In the year 1562, the same year she founded her first Reformed convent, Teresa wrote in her spiritual testimonies about an experience she had after communion. She said she saw the Blessed Virgin Mary place a white mantle over the entire community. Mary was protecting them, sheltering them, promising them that if they stayed faithful, she would lead them to her Son. Teresa clung to that promise for the rest of her life, through sickness, through opposition, through doubt, through the dark nights when she felt abandoned by God. She remembered the white mantle. She remembered Mary's promise, and she kept walking. That's the difference between the souls who reach the center and the souls who stay at the edges. The ones who reach the center remember the promises. They hold on to them. They believe them, even when everything else is falling apart, even when they feel nothing, even when the reptiles are swarming. They remember. They believe. They move. The souls who stay at the edges forget. They stop believing. They stop moving, not all at once, gradually, quietly, without ever making a conscious decision. One day they just realize, I'm not praying anymore. I'm not confessing anymore. I'm not seeking God anymore. I'm just going through the motions, and I'm okay with that. That's the moment Teresa feared. The moment when lukewarmness becomes comfortable. The moment when you stop fighting. The moment when you accept that this is as close to God as you're ever going to get. That's the moment hope dies. And when hope dies, the soul is already dead. It just doesn't know it yet. Teresa's final words, spoken to the nuns gathered around her deathbed, were simple. She said, "At last, Lord, I am a daughter of the Church." It was October 4th, 1582. She died at 9 o'clock in the evening. The nuns reported that her face, which had been twisted in pain for days, became peaceful, radiant, like she was seeing something beautiful. They opened her grave 9 months later. Her body was intact. In the soil beneath her, where her blood had dripped during burial, flowers had grown, red flowers. Alba de Tormes preserves her incorrupt heart to this day, marked with that mysterious wound. But there's one more vision Teresa described that reveals the whole pattern. She watched souls she knew personally, souls who had started with genuine devotion. One case involved a woman Teresa had known since childhood. A devout woman. She prayed the rosary daily. She attended Mass faithfully. But over the years, Teresa noticed something shifting. The woman started complaining about the priest's sermons being too long, about other parishioners being hypocrites. Small things, reasonable complaints. Then the complaints grew. She started skipping weekday masses, just on busy days. Then she stopped going to confession as often. Once a year became enough. She was basically good. Why bother the priest more? Then her prayer life dried up. The rosary felt mechanical. She kept saying the words, but her mind was always somewhere else. Planning dinner, worrying about money. She never made a conscious decision to stop praying from the heart. It just happened, gradually. Teresa tried to talk to her. Gently, she suggested spending more time in mental prayer. The woman bristled. She said she wasn't called to be a mystic. She was just ordinary. She said God understood. She said she was doing her best. But Teresa saw something the woman couldn't see. The woman had stopped moving. She had convinced herself that where she was good enough. Growth was for other people, saints, religious, not for regular mothers. And once she made that decision, she started drifting backward. Teresa knew what would happen. The woman would keep attending Mass. She would keep calling herself Catholic. But her soul would be standing outside the castle, maybe for the rest of her life. And when she died, she would face years in purgatory, suffering for all the grace she had refused. This pattern repeated everywhere Teresa looked. Nuns who entered religious life with burning love for Christ, but became focused on small comforts within a decade. Getting the better cell, having nicer food. They didn't break their vows. They just became comfortable, content with mediocrity. Priests who had been ordained with genuine zeal, but gradually stopped preparing their sermons, who shortened their prayers, who still said Mass, but no longer really encountered Christ there, who went through the motions, but whose hearts had gone cold. Lay people who had once been on fire, but slowly let faith become background noise, who still checked the Catholic box, but rarely thought about God, who taught their children prayers, but never actually prayed with them from the heart. Teresa saw them all, and she saw the pattern. None of them woke up one day and rejected God. They just stopped trying to get closer to Him. They stopped growing. They stopped moving. And in the spiritual life, when you stop moving forward, you drift backward. The current always flows away from God unless you're actively swimming toward Him. She documented this in her letters and testimonies. She wrote to a prioress in Seville, "Watch for the sisters who are always comfortable, the ones who never struggle in prayer. These are the dangerous ones, not because they're doing anything wrong, but because they're not doing anything right. They're coasting, and you cannot coast your way to heaven." In a letter written in 1576 to Father Jerome Gracian, her confessor, she described seeing a vision, a soul approaching judgment, a soul that had been Catholic its entire life, had received all the sacraments, had died in a state of grace. But when the soul stood before Christ, Christ looked at it with profound sadness. He said, "I called you every day. I gave you grace after grace. And what did you do? You ignored me. You were too busy, too comfortable. You gave me the minimum while giving everything else your maximum." Teresa didn't write what happened to that soul. She just said it terrified her to see Christ's sorrow. Not anger, sorrow, like a father watching his child waste a precious gift, like a king watching his beloved refuse to enter the palace he had prepared for them. This is what haunted Teresa more than the vision of hell itself. Because hell is for people who reject God openly, who choose evil consciously, who commit mortal sin and refuse to repent. That's a clear path, a definite choice. But what about the people who never reject God but never fully accept Him either? What about the ones who stay lukewarm, who keep God at arm's length while still wanting the benefits of being Christian, who want heaven but don't want to change, who want salvation but don't want transformation? Teresa concluded, based on her visions and her reading of Scripture and her experience with thousands of souls, that these people face a terrible judgment, not damnation necessarily, but a harsh reckoning, because they had everything and did nothing. They had grace and ignored it. They had time and wasted it. They had a castle waiting and they stayed outside. She wrote in her interior castle that God is more offended by lukewarmness in souls who know better than by great sins in souls who are struggling to change. The person who commits a serious sin but immediately repents, who confesses with tears, who begs for God's mercy and fights to do better, that person is closer to God than the person who commits no grave sins but also makes no effort to grow, because at least the first person wants God. The second person just wants to be comfortable. This is why Teresa pushed her nuns so hard, why she demanded hours of mental prayer, why she insisted on strict poverty, silence, fasting. Not because these things earn salvation, but because they break the pattern of comfort. They force the soul to wake up. They create the conditions where God can actually work. Because you cannot encounter God while you're distracted, comfortable, and full. You encounter Him in emptiness, in silence, in hunger, in the stripping away of everything that isn't Him. And most people will never do that voluntarily. They'll never choose the harder path. They'll always take the easy way, the minimum, the comfortable compromise, until one day they die, and they discover that the minimum wasn't enough, that God had been offering them so much more, and they refused it all, because they were afraid, or lazy, or distracted, or just convinced that they were fine where they were. Teresa's reform spread across Spain precisely because people recognized themselves in her diagnosis. They saw that she was right. They saw that lukewarmness had infected the church at every level. They saw that something needed to change. And they saw in Teresa someone who had actually made the journey from lukewarmness to union with God, someone who could show them the way. By the time she died in 1582, Teresa had founded 17 reformed convents for women and helped John of the Cross establish several for men. Hundreds of souls had entered the Discalced Carmelite order because of her. Thousands more had read her books and changed their lives. The ripples continue to this day, 5 centuries later, because the problem she identified hasn't gone away. Lukewarmness is still the most common spiritual disease. Comfort is still the most dangerous temptation. And the path from the courtyard to the center is still difficult, still demanding, still absolutely necessary. What Teresa saw in her visions, what she experienced in her own life, what she taught in her books, all points to one unavoidable truth. You cannot drift your way to God. You have to fight. You have to choose. Every single day. Will you move closer to Him, or will you stay where you are? And if you choose to stay, if you convince yourself that lukewarmness is acceptable, then you've made a decision. Maybe not consciously, maybe not explicitly, but you've decided that your comfort matters more than your salvation, that your convenience matters more than your transformation, that your current life matters more than your eternal destiny. Teresa would say, wake up. The king is calling, the door is open, the castle is waiting. But you have to move, one step, then another, toward the light, toward the center, toward the only thing that will ever satisfy your soul, before it's too late, before you drift so far that you forget the castle was ever there at all.